How did he survive Stalin's purges? Moscow, 1978. An old man sits in a Soviet apartment. He's 82, white-haired, still sharp-eyed behind his mustache. He's recognizable from decades of Soviet history. He outlived Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev. He outlived everyone who made the revolution. He's truly the last man standing, the last survivor of Lenin's inner circle. He was there at the Soviet Union's creation. And he remembers it all. He served in government continuously since 1926, through 4 general secretaries and brutal purges, through world wars and crises. His name is Anastas Mikoyan. His survival is a remarkable political story. He was the kind of man who could walk through a storm and emerge untouched between the raindrops. Or they said he'd leave only with communism. This describes his incredible political longevity, a survival across dangerous transitions. It needs more than just luck. This is Anastas Mikoyan's story. The Bolshevik leader Stalin never fully trusted. So how did he do it? How did he stay alive and in power while everyone else was consumed? The answer is complicated. It begins in the Caucasus Mountains, in a small Armenian village. Born in 1895, Mikoyan grew up in Russian Empire territory. He was Armenian with a distinct language and culture. His father was a carpenter, his family modest. He studied at a seminary in Tiflis. Just like Joseph Jugashvili, who became Stalin, their shared Caucasian roots mattered. The region's revolutionary underground was unique. It forged lasting relationships. Mikoyan joined the Bolsheviks in 1915. He threw himself into underground organizing. He showed the energy of young revolutionaries. He was arrested by Tsarist authorities multiple times. This showed his activity and ability to survive. The revolution came in 1917. Mikoyan was in Baku, a crucial city. Baku in 1917-18 was a city in crisis. Imperial authority collapsed. National movements rose. Foreign forces approached. The 26 Baku commissars were executed. Mikoyan was captured too, but he wasn't among the 26 shot. He survived, escaped, and rejoined the party. He already showed an unusual capacity for survival. Historians debate the exact details of his escape. But the pattern was set. Mikoyan was the one who didn't die. After Bolshevik power solidified, he rose fast. He had organizational talent. He was reliable and politically smart. By his late 20s, he was in the Politburo. Stalin noticed Mikoyan early on. They had a working relationship. Both were from the Caucasus region. They understood its unique political culture. Stalin used Mikoyan's skills. He gave him important positions and included him in his inner circle. But their relationship was never truly comfortable. Mikoyan had his own connections. His history predated Stalin's rise. He wasn't just a creation of Stalin's patronage. He had his own legitimacy. This independence troubled Stalin. Stalin trusted men whose careers he built. Mikoyan's existence came before Stalin's dominance. His Armenian background gave him hidden loyalties, and his intelligence made him useful. Stalin needed Mikoyan's abilities, even if he doubted his loyalty. In 1926, Mikoyan became Commissar of Trade. He managed Soviet commercial policy. This was during a transition to a command economy. He later controlled the Soviet food industry. This made him incredibly powerful. He was responsible for feeding the nation and for vital trade relations. This role required genuine expertise. It was harder to replace than political roles. Stalin could replace a commissar easily, but not someone who understood food supply. Mikoyan's role in collectivization and famine was dark. He was responsible for food policy then, that Soviet industrialization truly demanded. This also put him in a role where his knowledge was undeniable. It was expertise that you couldn't just easily pretend to have or swap out. unlike many political posts. Stalin could easily find another political officer to take one's place, but finding someone who actually knew how to handle crucial food distribution and commerce meant finding someone who genuinely understood those complex systems. Mikoyan's actions during the forced collectivization and the devastating famine of 1932 and 1933 represent a particularly grim chapter in his career. In his capacity as the official overseeing food policy and acquisition, he played a direct role in putting policies into action that led to the terrible famine, a tragedy that claimed millions of lives, mainly in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. His part in organizing the grain collection drives, which took food right out of the hands of already starving villages, means he's accountable for policies that had a devastating human cost. His supporters and his own later writings tried to paint him as someone who just followed orders from higher up, someone who tried to lessen the worst outcomes, someone with little power to change the core policies that caused the famine. But his critics point out he was a member of the Politburo, meaning he had the position and access to object if he truly wanted to, and that his involvement in the policies causing the famine was very real and significant, regardless of any private doubts he might have had. This contrast between the man behind the scenes, who might have known some policies were disastrous, and the official who carried out those policies diligently, is typical of almost anyone who managed to survive in Stalin's inner circle. The system demanded obedience, and obeying Stalin's system meant being part of its crimes. The question of whether Mikoyan was more or less eager, more or less cynical, more or less hesitant than others is important for judging him personally, but it doesn't change the fundamental truth of what that participation entailed. The Great Terror of 1937 and 1938 serves as the most striking example for understanding Mikoyan's situation and how he survived. The purges wiped out the Soviet political leadership with incredible efficiency. Out of 139 members and candidates elected to the Central Committee in 1934, 98 were arrested and executed. Of the nearly 2,000 delegates at that same Congress, over 1,100 were arrested. The original Bolsheviks, the generation that started the revolution, were almost completely eliminated. Mikoyan, however, survived. This wasn't because he was out of the picture, or because he was unknown or unimportant. He was a Politburo member, a top government official, precisely the type of person the terror was targeting. He was present at meetings where death sentences were approved. He even signed some of them, and he watched as friends and colleagues, people he'd known for years, were arrested and shot. His son, Sergei Mikoyan, who outlived his father and became a historian, wrote extensively about their family's experiences during that terrifying period. His accounts depict a household under immense emotional strain, always aware that the dreaded knock on the door could come any day, yet trying desperately to appear normal amidst the constant disappearances. Anastas Mikoyan's own brother was arrested and executed during the terror. His closest Armenian contacts, the group connected to him through political ties in the Caucasus, were arrested. The security forces were clearly watching his circles, probing the limits of his influence. So why did he survive when his support networks were being dismantled all around him? A few factors seem to have played a role, though no single reason fully explains it. One key factor was his continued usefulness. Mikoyan managed economic areas that the Soviet state genuinely needed, and he did it capably. He had developed expertise in trade and supply that couldn't easily be replaced. During a time when the Soviet economy was under severe pressure from rapid industrialization and increasingly from preparations for a war that all the leaders anticipated, his skills in economic management provided practical value, securing him a degree of protection. Another element was his political maneuvering. Mikoyan consistently made sure to show active support for Stalin's decisions, including the terror. He joined in condemning those being arrested, signed off on arrests, and made public statements supporting the crackdown on perceived enemies. This participation was both morally damaging and politically safeguarding. By actively endorsing the events, he demonstrated the loyalty crucial for survival, while also creating a level of complicity that made it harder for the authorities to then target him as one of those enemies. Khrushchev, who watched Mikoyan closely throughout the Stalin era, later described him in his memoirs as an individual with remarkable political acumen, possessing an almost instinctual grasp of how to navigate perilous situations, knowing precisely when to push forward and when to pull back, when to speak up and when to remain silent. This political intelligence itself served as a survival mechanism. The ability to gauge the political climate accurately enough to avoid the fatal mistakes that had doomed others. There was also, according to various accounts, a specific dynamic in Stalin's relationship with him. Stalin harbored genuine, documented suspicions about Mikoyan. He made comments about Mikoyan's Armenian heritage, the peculiar mindset he associated with Armenians, and his trading instincts, which Stalin found both useful and questionable. He tested Mikoyan repeatedly, engineering situations designed to reveal if his loyalty was real or just an act. Yet, he kept him, continued to rely on him, and kept appointing him to positions of real authority. The explanation favored by most historians is that Stalin's assessment of Mikoyan remained consistent over many years. He was more valuable alive and in his current role than dead, that his economic expertise was truly needed, and that his potential for independent political action was sufficiently limited by his status as a minority from the Caucasus, lacking a strong independent power base, that he could be controlled rather than eliminated. Mikoyan's performance during the war years clearly demonstrated the genuine worth of his economic expertise. As the People's Commissar of Foreign Trade during the war, he expertly managed the incredibly complex Lend-Lease program with the United States and Britain, through which vast amounts of military equipment, food, and industrial supplies were sent to the Soviet Union. Managing Lend-Lease demanded economic proficiency, diplomatic finesse, and the ability to handle relationships with foreign governments and officials in ways that few Soviet officials could. His work on the Lend-Lease supply chain, organizing supplies for the front, and overseeing the Soviet wartime economy under conditions of extreme disruption, was critically important to the Soviet Union's survival. The respect he earned from his American and British counterparts who worked with him reflected genuine professional competence. In the context of wartime economic management, he was one of the most capable individuals the Soviet state had available, and at that time the state desperately needed capable people. Stalin's death in March 1953 ushered in a new chapter for Mikoyan's career, one that would prove just as significant and require as much careful navigation as the Stalin period itself. The power struggle that followed Stalin's death placed Mikoyan in a position that was both powerful and precarious. He was a senior Politburo member, one of the most experienced leaders in the Soviet Union, a figure whose tenure predated everyone else's. He represented a valuable ally for any faction vying for power and a potential target if the wrong side won. He strategically positioned himself in the post-Stalin era, aligning with the forces that ultimately led to Khrushchev's rise while maintaining enough distance from any single group to avoid being destroyed by political shifts. His early backing for the rehabilitation of some Stalin-era victims, for admitting that certain aspects of Stalinist policy were mistakes, positioned him as a moderate reformer, without fully committing him to the extensive de-Stalinization that Khrushchev would later champion. Khrushchev's secret speech in February 1956 marked the most pivotal political event of the post-Stalin era, the moment when the Soviet leadership, or at least its dominant faction, chose to openly address the crimes of the Stalin period. Mikoyan's involvement in the preparation and delivery of that secret speech is documented in historical records. He was among those who supported some form of public acknowledgement of Stalin's wrongdoings, pushing within the leadership for a reckoning with the past, believing it was essential for the system's future legitimacy. His own speech at the 20th Party Congress, delivered just before Khrushchev's secret speech, was itself a significant contribution to the process of de-Stalinization, acknowledging past errors and issues in Soviet history in ways that had been completely impossible to voice publicly under Stalin. He was presenting himself as someone who had always privately harbored reservations about Stalinism, someone whose survival hadn't come at the price of complete surrender. How much of this later portrayal was accurate and how much was a strategic reinterpretation of his own history is hard to say. The available documents show a man actively involved in the Stalinist system, signing documents, attending meetings, and approving decisions that were part of the terror. His later depiction of himself as a reluctant participant, someone who tempered excesses and tried to limit damage where he could, is partly supported by evidence and partly a self-serving narrative. His later claims of being a hesitant participant, someone who tried to temper the worst excesses and minimize harm where possible, are a mix of genuine support from the facts and a narrative designed to make him look good. The Hungarian Revolution in October and November of 1956 really tested how far Mikoyan could push his reformist ideas. He was sent to Budapest as a Soviet representative during this intense crisis. He was one of the top officials tasked with managing the situation as Hungarians rose up against Soviet control. His reports back to Moscow and the policies he suggested showed a real effort to find a peaceful political solution, one that would avoid using military force. However, this approach was ultimately rejected when Khrushchev and the Presidium decided to send in Soviet troops. Historians still debate whether Mikoyan's preference for a political resolution in Hungary truly stemmed from his reformist beliefs or simply from a practical understanding that a military invasion would be costly and harmful. What's clear is that he favored seeking a negotiated outcome over the harsh military suppression that ultimately occurred, and his own position was overridden. His relationship with Khrushchev was a major defining factor throughout the decade following Stalin's death. Mikoyan stood by Khrushchev during the 1957 crisis when the anti-party group tried to oust him. His support played a crucial role in the balance of power that kept Khrushchev in charge. But Mikoyan was never just a loyal follower of Khrushchev. He maintained his own independent stance, a hallmark of his entire career. He supported Khrushchev but still kept his ability to disagree with specific policies and decisions. His involvement in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 was one of his most significant contributions after the war. He was dispatched to Cuba to negotiate with Fidel Castro, following the agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. This was a mission requiring incredible diplomatic skill. Castro was furious, feeling betrayed by the Soviets. He saw those weapons as Cuba's primary defense against an American attack, and the negotiation happened without Cuba's input. Mikoyan spent weeks in Havana managing his relationship with Castro, enduring Castro's anger, explaining the Soviet viewpoint, and preserving the Soviet-Cuban alliance through a crisis that could have easily destroyed it. Tragically, his wife passed away while he was in Cuba, yet he stayed at his post to finish the diplomatic task, not returning for her funeral. Regardless of how one views the political objectives he was serving, his decision to remain and complete his mission, rather than return home for his wife's funeral, demonstrates a level of professional dedication that went beyond typical political calculation. The fall of Khrushchev in October 1964, a palace coup orchestrated by Brezhnev, Kosygin, and others, was another transition that Mikoyan handled with his usual careful approach. He had been close to Khrushchev, but not so close that his own fate was tied to Khrushchev's survival. When the coup occurred, Mikoyan was the only member of the Presidium who defended Khrushchev. This was a principled yet strategically calculated move, significant enough to be noticed but not so much as to endanger his own position. He was then appointed chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, becoming the nominal head of state. This role provided continuity and legitimacy to the leadership change, though it was less powerful than his previous positions. It was an elegant transition into a senior but less central role, the kind of move the Soviet system often employed for figures who were too important to be simply dismissed but whose peak influence had passed. He stepped down from active political life in 1965, returning to his comfortable Moscow apartment. There, he would spend his remaining years as a respected elder statesman, writing his memoirs, meeting with visitors, and maintaining the image of a survivor who had witnessed it all. Mikoyan's memoirs, published in various forms and with differing degrees of candor during and after the Soviet era, are among the most valuable primary sources for understanding Soviet high-level politics. They detail the internal dynamics of the leadership, the personal traits of key figures, and the decision-making processes that shaped major Soviet policies, all from the viewpoint of someone who was present at nearly every significant event. They are also predictably self-serving in ways that historians must handle with care. Mikoyan consistently presented his own stances as more moderate, more reform-oriented, and more privately critical of Stalinist cruelties than the documentary evidence sometimes suggests. He highlighted instances where he advocated for restraint, downplaying or omitting times he participated in the system's violence. This type of selective memory and strategic presentation is common in political memoirs, but it requires particular critical scrutiny in his case, especially since much of what he describes cannot be independently verified. However, the memoirs do offer, with unusual frankness for a Soviet political figure, a sense of the psychological experience of living under the Stalinist system, the constant awareness of danger, managing relationships amidst perpetual uncertainty, and the specific attention required for survival. He describes Stalin in ways that reveal the dictator's personality and working methods, avoiding the adulatory bias of the Stalin period or the outright demonization found in some post-Stalin accounts. Anastas Mikoyan passed away on October 21, 1978, in Moscow at the age of 82. He received a state funeral befitting his rank and his history, laid to rest with the honors of the Soviet state he had helped to build and served for 6 decades. The well-known saying about surviving storms without getting wet captures one aspect of his life, but it doesn't tell the whole story. He wasn't simply lucky. He wasn't just cynical. He wasn't merely a man who told each new leader what they wanted to hear and shifted his allegiances with every political breeze. The historical record suggests he was a man of genuine political insight and substantial organizational ability who made a fundamental choice early in his career to operate within the Soviet system instead of opposing it. He then spent 60 years proving that this choice was sustainable, even through the system's most extreme phases. The moral price of that decision was immense. His involvement in collectivization, the purges, the suppression of Hungary, and all the crimes of the system he served. He was not innocent of those transgressions. His survival was bought with complicity. Yet, throughout that long career, he consistently sought to moderate extreme measures rather than escalate them. He worked toward outcomes less devastating than those proposed by his more fervent colleagues. He used his position within the system to carefully and gradually push for something slightly less dire than what the system's pure logic would have dictated. Whether this constitutes a form of moral achievement under impossible circumstances or simply a sophisticated brand of complicity presented through moderate language, is a question that different historians and readers will answer in their own way. It is, perhaps, the most fitting question to ponder at the conclusion of his story, because Mikoyan's life ultimately compels us to confront the question of what is achievable for individuals under extreme institutional pressure, and whether the choice between complete obedience and total resistance is the only one available. Or, if there's a third path of working within a system while attempting to steer its outcomes towards something less catastrophic. And if that third path exists, what are its personal costs, and what are the costs to the people impacted by the system that person serves? He navigated through the storm, emerging between the raindrops, but the rain fell on everyone else. And that fact, that simple, terrible truth, is what the elegant saying about political survival omits. How viewers answer that will vary. It's likely the most pertinent question to ponder as his narrative concludes. Because Mikoyan's life story ultimately compels us to confront what humans are capable of achieving when faced with immense pressure from rigid systems, and whether the decision is strictly between total obedience or outright defiance, or, if there's actually a middle ground, a way to operate within a system while subtly guiding its results toward less disastrous outcomes. And if such a path exists, what toll does it take on the individual who chooses it, and what impact does it have on the people impacted by the very system that person serves? He managed to walk through the storm, emerging seemingly untouched between the raindrops, but the devastating storm still rained down on everyone else. That stark, heartbreaking reality is what the clever phrase about political survival completely misses.